The coach humiliated Alexis Olympia Ohanian, not knowing that her mother was Serena Williams. What happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. The soft hum of the ceiling fan filled the living room as Serena Williams sat cross-legged on the couch, flipping through a worn leather photo album. The scent of lavender candles lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee from the kitchen. Her daughter, Alexis Olympia Ohanian, perched beside her, her small hands tracing the glossy edges of old photos with wide, curious eyes. "Was this really you, Mom?" Alexis asked, holding up a picture of Serena mid-swing, beads flying in every direction as her racket sliced through the air. "That's me," Serena said with a smile, though the image stirred conflicting emotions. She could still remember the sound of boos from the crowd during that match, the sting of words muttered just loud enough for her to hear. But she forced those memories back, focusing instead on Alexis's excitement. "You look unstoppable," Alexis whispered, as if afraid to disturb the power radiating from the image. Serena reached out and tucked a stray curl behind Alexis's ear. "I wasn't always," she said. "I had to fight for it, and I mean really fight." Alexis's eyes flicked up to meet hers. "I want to fight too," she said. "I want to be just like you." The words made Serena's heart swell and ache at the same time. She had dreamed of this moment, her daughter following in her footsteps, but she also knew the price that came with it, the doubts, the scrutiny, the hate. "Being like me isn't easy, baby," Serena said softly. "It takes more than talent. It takes grit, strength, and sometimes," she hesitated, "sometimes it takes standing alone when the world is against you." Alexis straightened her shoulders. "I can do that," she said, determination lighting up her young face. Serena nodded but felt a pang of unease. Could her daughter really understand what that meant? The sun hung low in the sky later that afternoon as Serena and her husband, Alexis Ohanian, sat at the kitchen island, flipping through a stack of resumes and training profiles. Alexis had his laptop open, browsing videos of potential coaches while Serena scanned paper files. "She needs someone tough," Serena said. "She's 10, Alexis countered, not looking up from the screen. "Exactly," Serena replied. "She needs discipline now, or she'll never make it later." Alexis looked at her then, his expression serious. "Is this about her, or about you?" Serena opened her mouth to argue, but closed it again. Was it about her? Was she pushing too hard? She shook the thought away. No, Alexis wanted this. She wanted it as much as Serena did. "There's one more name," Alexis said, clicking on a video. "Nick Harper." Serena stiffened. The name was familiar. Nick Harper had trained champions, but he was also known for pushing his players to the brink. Some called him a genius, others called him a tyrant. "He's the best," Serena said. "He's also controversial," Alexis reminded her. Serena looked at the screen. Nick's face filled the frame, a sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, and an expression that seemed carved from stone. He barked commands at a group of teenagers, his voice cold and unforgiving. "That's what she needs," Serena said. "No hand-holding, no excuses." Alexis hesitated but finally nodded. "I'll set up a meeting." 2 days later, Serena and Alexis stood in front of a sprawling tennis academy surrounded by tall iron gates and neatly trimmed hedges. "You ready?" Serena asked. Alexis gripped her racket tighter and nodded. Nick Harper was waiting inside the facility, clipboard in hand. He looked just as severe in person, his short-cropped hair and towering frame making him seem even more intimidating. His handshake was firm, but his eyes lingered on Serena for a moment too long, as if assessing whether she still had the fire that once defined her. "So, this is your daughter," Nick said, glancing down at Alexis. "She's small." Alexis's face fell, but she quickly masked it with a determined expression. "She's strong," Serena corrected. Nick shrugged. "We'll see." The first session started almost immediately. Nick didn't waste time with introductions or icebreakers. Instead, he had Alexis running sprints around the court while barking out instructions. "Faster!" he yelled. "You're not here to look pretty. You're here to win." Alexis's legs burned, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Serena watched from the sidelines, biting her lip. She had wanted someone tough, and Nick was delivering, but she couldn't ignore the way Alexis flinched under his words. "Take a water break," Nick finally said, but before Alexis could grab her bottle, he added, "You're wasting time. Don't think I don't see you dragging your feet." The comment hit harder than any missed swing. Alexis's shoulders slumped for just a moment before she squared them again and jogged back onto the court. "She's got potential," Nick told Serena later, but his tone was flat. "If she learns to stop acting like a spoiled princess—" Serena bristled. "She's not spoiled." "Maybe not yet," Nick said. "But kids like her, with famous parents and cushy lives, they don't know what it means to fight. We'll see if she can handle it." Serena wanted to argue, but part of her feared he was right. That night, Alexis lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her muscles ached, and her skin still burned from the sun, but her mind was racing. Nick didn't think she was good enough. He didn't think she was strong. "I'll prove him wrong," she whispered to herself. She closed her eyes and imagined herself standing on a podium holding a trophy high above her head. The crowd was cheering, and Nick was forced to eat his words. She fell asleep with that image burned into her mind. But somewhere, deep inside, a small voice whispered doubts she wasn't ready to face. The morning sun cast long shadows over the court as Alexis stood at the baseline, gripping her racket so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her legs ached from the endless drills the day before, but she forced herself to keep moving. Nick Harper paced the sidelines, his sharp eyes tracking her every movement. "Footwork, Alexis. You're dragging your feet again," he barked, slamming his clipboard against his palm. "You think this is a dance class? Get your knees up." Alexis flinched but didn't slow down. She pushed herself harder, sweat dripping down her forehead and stinging her eyes. She wanted to prove him wrong, to show him she wasn't just Serena Williams' daughter coasting on privilege. But no matter how hard she tried, it never seemed enough. "Stop," Nick said suddenly, and Alexis froze, struggling to catch her breath. He walked toward her, his shoes squeaking against the court. "You're too soft, too slow. If you can't handle this, you're wasting my time. And yours." Alexis's stomach twisted, but she refused to let the tears burn in her eyes fall. She nodded stiffly and waited for the next drill. Nick smirked. "That's what I thought." The days blurred into one grueling session after another. Nick was relentless, breaking Alexis down piece by piece. He criticized everything: her grip, her stance, even the way she breathed between serves. "You're trying too hard," he snapped one day, throwing his clipboard onto the bench. "Stop acting like you care so much about what people think. Nobody cares about you. They care about winners." His words cut deeper than the blisters forming on Alexis's hands. At night, she replayed every insult in her head, wondering if he was right. Maybe she wasn't strong enough. Maybe she didn't belong here. But quitting wasn't an option. The other kids at the academy were no better. They saw her as an outsider, someone who didn't belong. The whispers started almost immediately, spreading through the locker rooms and across the courts. "She's only here because of her mom," one girl sneered as Alexis walked by. "I heard her dad's a billionaire," another added. "Bet she doesn't even have to pay for lessons." Alexis pretended not to hear, but their words clung to her. During drills, they went out of their way to make her feel isolated, refusing to pair up with her for practice and laughing when she missed a shot. One afternoon, during a practice match, one of the older girls deliberately aimed a serve directly at Alexis, hitting her in the shoulder. The impact knocked her off balance, and she stumbled backward, dropping her racket. "Oops," the girl said, smirking. "Maybe next time you'll pay attention." Nick stood by, arms crossed, but said nothing. Alexis picked up her racket and forced herself to keep playing, but her chest burned with humiliation. Serena started noticing the change in her daughter almost immediately. Alexis came home quieter, more withdrawn. She spent hours practicing in the backyard after dark, hitting balls against the wall until her arms gave out. One evening, Serena found her sitting on the edge of her bed, staring down at her blistered hands. "Alexis?" Alexis looked up quickly, hiding her hands in her lap. "I'm fine, Mom." Serena frowned and sat beside her. "You don't look fine." "It's just practice," Alexis said. "Nick says I need to work harder." Serena felt a flicker of doubt, but pushed it aside. She had chosen Nick for a reason. He was tough, and toughness was what Alexis needed if she wanted to succeed. "You're strong," Serena said, squeezing her shoulder. "You've got this." Alexis tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The next morning, Nick pushed her harder than ever. He made her run suicides until her legs felt like they might give out, then forced her to repeat volleys until her arms shook. "Pathetic," he muttered under his breath after one missed shot. Alexis's face burned, but she kept going. Later, while she was catching her breath, Nick approached her with his usual sharp stare. "You don't have what it takes," he said bluntly. "Not yet, anyway." Alexis swallowed hard. "Then help me get there." Nick tilted his head, as if considering the possibility. "We'll see. But only if you're ready to stop acting like some spoiled little princess and start acting like a competitor." The days grew longer and the pressure mounted. Alexis began waking up with knots in her stomach, dreading what each new practice would bring. She barely spoke during dinner, her mind consumed by thoughts of drills and criticism. Serena continued to watch, torn between pride and worry. She wanted to believe Nick's methods were working, that Alexis was growing stronger, but the shadows under her daughter's eyes told a different story. Then came the tournament. It was supposed to be a test, a chance for Alexis to prove herself. But the moment she stepped onto the court, everything fell apart. Her opponent was older, faster, and more experienced. Within minutes, Alexis was losing badly. Her serves were off, her returns weak. Nick stood at the edge of the court, arms crossed, watching with thinly veiled disappointment. "Focus!" he shouted as she missed another shot. The crowd murmured, and Alexis's chest tightened. She tried to shake it off, but the weight of their stares and Nick's expectations crushed her. By the time the match ended, Alexis had lost in straight sets. Nick didn't wait for her to leave the court. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. "You embarrassed yourself out there." "I tried," Alexis said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Try harder," he snapped, "or go home." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't let him see her cry. That night, Alexis lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her body ached and her mind raced. No matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. Nick didn't believe in her. The other kids didn't respect her. And maybe, just maybe, they were right. Alexis Olympia Ohanian sat in the corner of the locker room, her knees drawn up to her chest as muffled voices and laughter filled the space outside. The sting of her recent loss still clung to her skin, heavier than the sweat soaking her clothes. She traced the ridges of her racket's grip, feeling the grooves dig into her fingertips. The defeat hadn't just been humiliating, it had been public. She had failed in front of Nick, in front of her mother, and in front of herself. The echoes of Nick's harsh words rang in her ears. What the hell was that? Her stomach churned as she replayed the match, her every mistake magnified. The crowd's whispers, the scattered applause for her opponent, and Nick's cold dismissal all swirled together in her mind, forming a storm she couldn't quiet. The locker room door creaked open, and Alexis tensed. A group of older girls entered, their laughter cutting through the air like shards of glass. She kept her head down, hoping to go unnoticed, but it was no use. "Look, who's hiding," one of the girls said. Her name was Madison, and she was one of Nick's star players. She leaned against the lockers, arms crossed. How does it feel to let everyone down? Alexis's grip on her racket tightened, but she said nothing. She probably thought her mommy would save her, another girl added, and the others laughed. "Yeah, must be nice to have Serena Williams fighting your battles for you," Madison said. "Too bad it didn't help you win." Alexis's cheeks burned. She wanted to defend herself, to snap back, but her voice refused to cooperate. Instead, she stood abruptly, shoving her racket into her bag. "Running away already?" Madison taunted. Alexis pushed past them without a word, but their laughter followed her out the door. She found Nick waiting for her outside the gym. His arms were crossed, and his expression was unreadable. "You're late," he said flatly. Alexis swallowed the lump in her throat. "No excuses," he interrupted. "You embarrassed yourself today, and if you think I'm going to coddle you because you're Serena Williams' daughter, you're wrong." Alexis flinched at the mention of her mother. "Get on the court," Nick barked. She dropped her bag and did as she was told. The drills started immediately. No warm-up, no breaks. Nick pushed her harder than ever, his voice a constant barrage of criticism. "Faster! Eyes up! Stop acting like a scared little girl." The words hit like punches, but Alexis refused to stop. Her muscles screamed and her vision blurred, but she kept going until her legs finally gave out and she collapsed to the ground. Nick stood over her, his shadow stretching long across the court. "Pathetic," he said, and walked away. That night, Alexis sat at the dinner table, pushing her food around her plate. Serena watched her carefully, noting the way her shoulders slumped and the dark circles under her eyes. "How was practice?" Serena asked. Alexis shrugged. "Fine." "Alexis?" She looked up, and for a moment, Serena saw something raw and broken flicker in her daughter's eyes. But just as quickly, it was gone. "I said I'm fine," Alexis repeated. Serena's jaw tightened, but she let it go. She wanted to press, to dig deeper, but part of her feared what she might uncover. Instead, she changed the subject, talking about her own training days and the sacrifices it took to succeed. Alexis nodded along, but her mind was elsewhere. The next day brought more humiliation. During a practice match, Alexis faced off against Madison. The other girl played aggressively, slamming shots into the corners and forcing Alexis to chase. Nick stood by, watching closely but saying nothing. Then it happened. Madison hit a hard forehand directly at Alexis's body. Alexis reacted too late, and the ball struck her arm, knocking the racket from her grip. The other kids erupted in laughter. "Nice reflexes, superstar," Madison sneered. Alexis bent down to retrieve her racket, her hands trembling. She expected Nick to say something, to call out Madison for the cheap shot, but he didn't. Instead, he smirked. "Get up," he said. "You're not done." The bullying continued off the court. In the locker room, in the hallways, even during water breaks, the whispers and taunts followed her. "Rich girl can't handle the heat." Maybe she should stick to modeling. She'll never be as good as her mom. Alexis tried to block it out, but the words stuck. She practiced harder, staying late after sessions to run drills on her own. She hit ball after ball against the wall, her anger fueling her swings until her hands blistered and bled. But no matter how hard she worked, Nick never seemed satisfied. Serena began to notice the changes more clearly. Alexis barely spoke anymore. She skipped meals, stayed up late, and often woke up in tears after nightmares she refused to talk about. One evening, Serena found her daughter outside, practicing serves in the dark. "Alexis," Serena called, but Alexis didn't stop. "Alexis!" The ball hit the net, and Alexis spun around, her eyes wild. "I have to get better," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't let him win." Serena froze. "Who?" But Alexis didn't answer. Instead, she collapsed to her knees, her shoulders shaking. Serena ran to her, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "It's okay," she whispered, but the words felt hollow. The breaking point came a week later. During practice, Nick singled Alexis out in front of the entire group. "You'll never be good enough," he said. "You're weak, and everyone here knows it." The words cut deep, but it was the look in his eyes that shattered her, the sheer disdain, as if she wasn't even worth his time. Alexis dropped her racket and walked off the court. "Where do you think you're going?" Nick called after her. She didn't answer. That night, Serena walked in on Alexis crying in her room. "Talk to me," she said softly, and this time Alexis did. She told her everything, the insults, the taunts, the bullying. She told her how Nick stood by and let it happen, how he joined in, how he made her feel worthless. Serena listened, her rage simmering beneath the surface. She had trusted Nick to help her daughter grow stronger, but instead he had broken her down. "It's over," Serena said firmly. "We're done with him." Alexis looked up, her eyes wide. "But what about—" "No," Serena said. "No more." And for the first time in weeks, Alexis felt like she could finally breathe. Alexis sat in the passenger seat of her mother's SUV, staring out the window as the blurred shapes of houses and trees rushed past. The ride home from the academy was unusually silent, the air thick with unspoken words. Serena gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale against the leather. Neither of them had spoken since leaving the court. Alexis's heart still pounded from the confrontation with Nick, his voice echoing in her head. "You'll never be good enough." She closed her eyes, willing herself to forget, but the words wouldn't fade. When they arrived home, Serena shut off the engine and turned to her daughter. "Inside," she said. Alexis hesitated but followed. She trailed behind her mother through the foyer and into the living room where Serena paced back and forth, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Sit down," Serena said, gesturing to the couch. Alexis obeyed, sinking into the cushions as her mother stopped in front of her, eyes blazing. "Tell me everything," Serena demanded. "No more hiding, no more pretending." Alexis hesitated, but the look on her mother's face left no room for argument. Her voice trembled as she began to speak, recounting every cruel word, every humiliation. She told her about the endless drills, the taunts from the other kids, and the way Nick had joined in, how he had made her feel small and weak. Serena's expression hardened with every word, her jaw tightening and her fists clenching at her sides. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked when Alexis finished. "I didn't want you to think I was weak," Alexis whispered. Serena dropped to her knees in front of her daughter and took her hands. "You're not weak," she said fiercely. "Don't you ever let anyone make you believe that." Tears welled in Alexis's eyes, and for the first time in weeks she let them fall. Later that night, after Alexis had gone to bed, Serena sat alone in her study, scrolling through articles and interviews about Nick Harper. The more she read, the angrier she became. There were whispers of past complaints, students who had quit under his training, rumors of verbal abuse, and even accusations of inappropriate comments, but none of it had stuck. Nick's reputation as a builder of champions had always overshadowed the allegations. Serena's hands trembled as she closed her laptop. She had trusted him. She had let him near her daughter. Not anymore. The next morning, Serena returned to the academy, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floors. Nick was in his office, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression that made her blood boil. "Serena," he said, spreading his arms as if welcoming an old friend, "did you come to apologize for your daughter's performance yesterday?" Serena slammed the door behind her. "You think this is a joke?" she snapped. "You think you can talk to my daughter like that, treat her like she's nothing, and get away with it?" Nick's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He straightened, fixing her with a cold stare. "Don't act like you don't know how this works," he said. "You and I both know that tennis isn't a game for the weak." "She's 10 years old," Serena shouted. "She's old enough to learn," Nick shot back. "You didn't get where you are by being coddled, Serena, or did you forget?" Serena stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I never forgot. But I also never needed someone like you to tear me down just to build me back up." Nick's eyes narrowed. "You want to pull her out? Go ahead, but we both know she'll never make it without me." Serena stared at him for a long moment, her heart pounding. Then she turned and walked out, slamming the door behind her. Over the next few days, Serena began speaking out. She gave interviews to sports networks and posted statements on social media, detailing the abuse Alexis had endured. Her words struck a nerve, sparking conversations about the culture of coaching and the hidden costs of chasing greatness. Other athletes began coming forward, former students of Nick's who had faced similar treatment. Their stories painted a damning picture of a man who thrived on power and control, pushing his students to the brink and then blaming them when they broke. Nick tried to defend himself, calling the accusations exaggerations and excuses from kids who couldn't handle the pressure. But the floodgates had already opened. Meanwhile, Alexis struggled with conflicting emotions. Part of her felt relieved to be free from Nick's grasp, but another part of her couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed. She spent hours in the backyard, hitting balls against the practice wall until her arms burned. She told herself it was training, but deep down, she knew it was punishment. One evening, Serena joined her on the court. "You don't have to prove anything," Serena said as Alexis wiped sweat from her brow. "Yes, I do," Alexis replied, "to myself." Serena studied her daughter for a moment before nodding. "Then let's do it right," she said. Serena hired a new coach, someone who believed in discipline but also in encouragement. Alexis was wary at first, flinching at even the gentlest criticism, but slowly she began to rebuild her confidence. Her new coach focused on fundamentals, helping her unlearn the bad habits she had picked up under Nick's harsh methods. It wasn't easy. Alexis had to fight against the voices in her head that told her she wasn't good enough. But with each session, those voices grew quieter. Nick's downfall came swiftly. As more stories emerged, the Tennis Federation launched an investigation into his practices. He was suspended pending the outcome, and his academy began losing students. Sponsors pulled their support, and within weeks, Nick Harper's career was in ruins. Alexis followed the news with mixed feelings. Part of her felt vindicated, but another part still carried the scars he had left behind. Serena noticed the conflict and sat her daughter down one night. "He didn't break you," she said. "Don't let him live in your head. He's done, and you're just getting started." Alexis nodded, but she knew the journey wasn't over yet. As Alexis prepared for her next tournament, she felt the familiar weight of expectation pressing down on her, but this time it was different. She wasn't fighting to prove something to Nick, or to the kids who had bullied her. She was fighting for herself. And she wasn't alone. Serena stood beside her, just as she always had, ready to catch her if she fell, but trusting her to stand on her own. The early morning light spilled through the windows of Serena Williams' home, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. Alexis sat at the kitchen table, a bowl of cereal untouched in front of her. She stirred it absently, her thoughts far from breakfast. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind, leaving Nick's academy, speaking out about his treatment, and watching the fallout as his reputation unraveled. Yet, despite the victories, Alexis couldn't shake the lingering doubt that clawed at the edges of her confidence. She glanced up as Serena entered the kitchen, her phone in hand and brows furrowed. "Another interview request," Serena said, setting the phone down on the counter. "ESPN this time." Alexis's stomach twisted. She hated the attention, hated the way people looked at her now, not as a tennis player, but as a victim. "I don't want to talk about it anymore," Alexis muttered. Serena crossed the room and knelt beside her. "I know this has been hard," she said gently, "but speaking out wasn't just about you. It was about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Alexis's eyes flicked to her mother's. "What if it doesn't change anything?" Serena's gaze hardened. "It will," she said, "but only if we keep fighting." Later that day, Serena and Alexis arrived at a press conference, cameras flashing as they stepped onto the stage. Serena spoke first, her voice steady but edged with anger, as she recounted Alexis's experiences and called for reforms in coaching standards. "This isn't just about one coach," Serena said. "It's about a system that allows this kind of abuse to go unchecked. That ends today." When it was Alexis's turn to speak, her hands trembled as she gripped the microphone. "I thought if I worked hard enough, I could prove I deserved to be there," Alexis said, her voice wavering. "But no matter what I did, it was never enough, and the more I tried, the more they tore me down." She paused, swallowing hard. "I'm not weak," she said finally, her voice stronger, "and I won't let them make me feel that way ever again." The room erupted in applause, but Alexis barely heard it. She stepped back, exhaling shakily as Serena squeezed her hand. The media storm intensified after the press conference. Interviews, opinion pieces, and social media debates flooded the internet. Support poured in from fellow athletes, celebrities, and fans, But there were also critics, voices accusing Serena of using her daughter to gain attention, others questioning whether Alexis had exaggerated her claims. Alexis tried not to read the comments, but it was impossible to avoid them entirely. The doubts they planted grew like weeds, tangling with her insecurities. "Why do people hate me so much?" she asked Serena one night, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They don't hate you," Serena said, brushing the hair back from Alexis's face. "They're afraid of what you represent, change, and change always makes people uncomfortable." Meanwhile, the investigation into Nick Harper gained momentum. More former students came forward with stories of verbal abuse and intimidation, and a formal inquiry was launched by the Tennis Federation. Reporters camped outside Nick's academy, pressing him for comments, but he remained defiant. "I did what needed to be done to make champions," he said in one televised interview. "This generation's too soft. If they can't handle criticism, they don't belong in this sport." But as the accusations piled up, Nick's sponsors began to drop him. Parents withdrew their children from his academy, and his once flawless reputation crumbled. Despite the progress, Alexis struggled to move on. She felt like she was stuck in a loop, reliving the worst moments of her time with Nick every time she stepped onto the court. Her new coach, Leah Martinez, was patient but firm, helping Alexis rebuild her skills and confidence. "You're not broken," Leah told her one afternoon after a particularly frustrating session. "You're healing, and healing takes time." But time felt like the enemy. Alexis wanted results, wanted proof that she was getting better. Her chance came when she was invited to compete in a regional tournament. It wasn't a high-stakes event, but it was her first competition since leaving Nick's academy, and the pressure felt suffocating. The morning of the tournament, Alexis stood in front of the mirror, dressed in her tennis whites, her hands shaking as she adjusted the sweatbands on her wrists. "You don't have to do this," Serena said from the doorway. "Yes, I do," Alexis replied. When they arrived at the courts, Alexis's nerves spiked as she saw Nick standing on the sidelines. He wasn't coaching. He had been barred from working with minors while the investigation continued, but he was there, watching. She felt his eyes on her as she warmed up, and her grip on her racket tightened. "You can do this," Serena whispered, placing a hand on her shoulder. Alexis nodded, but her heart hammered in her chest as she stepped onto the court. The match was brutal. Her opponent was older, taller, and stronger, and Alexis quickly fell behind. Every mistake felt magnified, every misstep a reminder of Nick's words. "You'll never be good enough." But then she looked up and saw her mother watching, her expression calm and steady. "You've got this," Serena mouthed. Something shifted inside Alexis. She stopped playing to avoid mistakes and started playing to win. She fought for every point, her movements sharper, her focus unshakable. When she finally won the match, the applause felt deafening. She stood at the net, shaking her opponent's hand, and then turned to face the crowd. Nick was gone. That night, Alexis sat with Serena on the couch, the tournament trophy resting on the coffee table between them. "Did you see him leave?" Alexis asked. Serena nodded. "He couldn't stand to see you win." Alexis smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. "I guess that means I did." The fight for justice didn't end there. Nick was formally banned from coaching, and new regulations were introduced to protect young athletes from abuse. Serena continued to advocate for change, using her platform to amplify the voices of others who had been silenced. And Alexis kept training, not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove herself right. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Alexis Olympia Ohanian stood in the dimly lit hallway outside the locker room, gripping her racket case as muffled cheers and announcements echoed through the stadium. The faint vibration of the crowd seemed to pulse in her chest, a mixture of anticipation and fear simmering just beneath the surface. She exhaled slowly, her breath shaky despite months of preparation. Today wasn't just another match. It was a statement. The regional tournament had been a turning point, but this, her first national-level competition, was something entirely different. The stakes were higher, the pressure more intense, and somewhere out there she knew Nick Harper would be watching. Even if he wasn't physically present, his shadow lingered, a reminder of the voice that had once told her she wasn't good enough. "Ready?" Serena's voice broke through her thoughts, steady and grounding. Alexis turned to see her mother standing just behind her, arms crossed but eyes soft with reassurance. Serena's presence had become Alexis's anchor, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone. Alexis nodded, though her palms felt damp against the handle of her racket case. "You've done the work," Serena said, stepping closer. "You belong here." The words struck something deep inside Alexis, cutting through the lingering doubts. She squared her shoulders and forced herself to breathe. "I'm ready." The match began under bright, almost blinding lights. Alexis's opponent was ranked higher, an older girl with a reputation for aggression and precision. Within the first few games, it became clear just how fierce the competition was. Alexis lost the first set 6-3, her nerves betraying her in critical moments. She double-faulted twice in a row during the third game, and by the time she regained her composure, her opponent had already built an unshakable lead. The crowd murmured as Alexis walked to her bench during the break between sets. She wiped sweat from her brow, her heart pounding as the pressure threatened to overwhelm her. In the stands, Serena leaned forward, her expression unreadable. Alexis closed her eyes. She thought of Nick's voice, sharp and cruel, echoing in her mind. "You'll never be good enough." But then she remembered her mother's voice, softer but stronger. "You belong here." She stood and stepped back onto the court. The second set was different. Alexis dug deep, channeling every lesson she'd learned, not just about tennis but about resilience. She moved faster, struck harder, and refused to let mistakes rattle her. Her opponent seemed caught off guard by the shift, and Alexis took advantage of every opening. She won the set 6-4, forcing a decider. By the time the third set began, the crowd was electric. Every rally felt like a battle, each point hard-fought and exhausting. Alexis could feel the burn in her legs and arms, but she pushed through it, driven by something stronger than fear: determination. When the final point was called in her favor, she dropped to her knees, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions crashing over her. The cheers erupted around her, but all she could hear was her own heartbeat. She had done it. Later, as she stood on the podium with the trophy in her hands, Alexis scanned the crowd. For a moment, her eyes searched for Nick, half expecting to see his disapproving stare. But he wasn't there. Instead, she found Serena clapping proudly from the front row. Their eyes met, and Alexis felt something shift inside her, a release of the weight she had carried for so long. This victory wasn't just about tennis. It was about reclaiming her confidence, her identity, and her voice. In the days that followed, Alexis's victory became a headline. The media shifted its focus from the controversy surrounding Nick Harper to Alexis's resilience and talent. Interviews poured in, But this time Alexis faced them with her head held high. She spoke openly about her journey, about the doubts and fears she had battled, and about the importance of standing up against abuse. "It's not just about winning," she said during one interview. "It's about knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone take that away from you." Her words resonated, sparking more conversations about the treatment of young athletes and the need for systemic change. Meanwhile, Nick Harper's fall from grace continued. The investigation concluded with a lifetime ban from coaching, and several lawsuits followed, filed by former students who had come forward after Alexis's story broke. For Alexis, it wasn't revenge. It was closure. She didn't need Nick's validation anymore. She had proven to herself and to the world that she was more than his words. Training resumed quickly, but something was different now. Leah Martinez, her new coach, noticed the shift almost immediately. Alexis was more focused, more driven, but also more balanced. She no longer flinched at criticism or pushed herself to exhaustion out of fear. "You're playing like someone who knows they belong here," Leah said one afternoon after practice. Alexis smiled. "Because I do." Months passed, and Alexis continued to rise through the ranks. But no matter how high she climbed, she never forgot the lessons she had learned. Not just on the court, but off it. She began mentoring younger players, sharing her experiences, and offering advice to those who struggled with self-doubt or faced similar challenges. One afternoon, as she stood by the practice courts, she noticed a young girl sitting alone, clutching her racket with the same nervous energy Alexis once carried. Alexis approached her and knelt down. "First tournament?" The girl nodded. "Scared?" Another nod. Alexis smiled. "Good. That means you care. Now, let's make sure you use that." The girl's eyes widened, and Alexis saw something familiar in them: hope. Later that evening, Alexis sat with Serena on their patio, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You're proud of her, aren't you?" Serena asked. Alexis looked up, surprised. "Who?" "The girl you talked to today." Alexis smiled softly. "Yeah, I think she's going to be great." Serena nodded, just like her mentor. Alexis leaned back in her chair, letting the moment settle around her. She had come so far, through fear, humiliation, and doubt, but she had emerged stronger. And as the sun disappeared behind the trees, Alexis knew this wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends. Maybe it will inspire someone. Watch our other videos for more powerful stories.